thanks so much for organising this, Jim. And I also want to say a big thanks to Roy, both for reading the book and engaging with the book, and also for my whole career working on atrocity prevention has been inspired by Roy's work. I started life working on former Yugoslavia, and Roy's work on Bosnia was hugely influential in that. So it's a massive pleasure to be able to be with you and to be talking with Roy and everyone else about this issue. I see you're already into a really rich discussion about how the world responded to the civil war and atrocities in Syria. So what I might do, just to save a bit of time, I might skip over the part of the talk where I was just going to sort of run through what the book does in relation to Syria. And basically, the book is it's a sort of a contemporary history of the international response to the Syrian civil war, trying to answer the question of why was there such a gap between the normative commitment made by states to principles like the responsibility to protect and civilian protection and the international response, which in the book I argued not only failed to protect civilians, but in some important respects was also complicit in their suffering and the atrocities. And what I thought I'd do is skip to 10 observations that I've sort of made on the basis of that book about where we are with atrocity prevention more generally. And as I was making them and reflecting back on some of Roy's earlier work, it was startling and a little depressing to figure that some of these things were problems in the field that were identified back in the 1990s and that still have not been well addressed. And in at least one instance, there was one where we started to address it and then have sort of moved away since. So here's my 10. The first one, and some of these are going to sound fairly basic, but I think sometimes in conversations about atrocity prevention, it's worth covering some of the basic things. And the first one being that atrocities are tactical and operational tools. That is, actors perpetrate atrocities because it helps them get what they want. And I think one of the things that's happening in the past decade is more and more actors are finding that atrocities are more and more effective. Bashar al-Assad still governs Syria because he committed widespread and systematic atrocities, because 40,000 people were tortured to death in Syrian prisons and security institutions, because cities were leveled with indiscriminate bombardment. Atrocities were used because they were effective. They're not sort of pathological, they're not irrational, they are strategic and operational and tactical tools. And my worry is that they are going to become more likely in the years to come because they're being more effective. And they're being more effective because the world is doing less and less to stand up to atrocities. So they become more appealing as tools. And one thing that you notice when you look at lots of different cases is that perpetrators learn from each other. They learn the strategies and tactics that seem to work. So we've seen, for example, several atrocity perpetrators use the tactics employed by the Sri Lankan government in 2009 of closing off the media, creating obfuscation, clearing out humanitarian workers, and then doing short, sharp uses of force, indiscriminate uses of force, in the expectation that in the immediate term, you'll receive a lot of international condemnation, but you will achieve the goal that you want to achieve. And then eventually, after a few months or years, the condemnation will wither away and you'll be able to come out of it. We see perpetrators learning from each other. The second thing I think that comes out really clear, and it's been clear in past cases, and it was clear in Syria, is that there are always other imperatives beyond the humanitarian, and the humanitarian imperative is rarely the most significant. So a quote that I use all the way through the book is that famous quote from Lakhdar Brahimi, pointing out that the protection of Syria's civilians was nobody's first, second, or third priority. And it is almost always so. There are almost always other priorities guiding state behavior. And when states have to make a choice between civilian protection or atrocity prevention and some other priority, be that satisfying an ally or achieving some other strategic objective, it remains the case that despite the piling up of normative and legal commitments, the other priorities tend to almost always hold sway. But the other thing, the thing that came out really clearly in the Syria case was just how many levels of politics there are and that need to be engaged with. So it's not just that you've got Syria level politics and global level politics, but you had, of course, regional politics. And often we in the West tend to downplay the influence of the regional politics and the fact that you had a series of regional competitions going on too, as well as interaction between the regional and the global level, which is really significant in the Syrian case. My third point is one that my friend and colleague Paul Williams, who I see is on the call, pointed out to me when he read the first draft of the manuscript. And he said what came out, one of the things that came out really clearly in the first draft was just how early multilateral options were closed down. So the first 12 months basically saw the closing down of multilateral options with the vetoes at the Security Council. And what that did was basically undercut the West's preferred strategy, which was to apply pressure multilaterally on the Assad regime in the hope of coercing that regime to change its position. But that was closed down very, very early. And it strikes me that the rest of the book is in part a story of how we still don't have a good plan B for what to do when those multilateral paths are closed down early. The fourth is a play on one I've mentioned earlier, which is just this idea that there are always other priorities, and there are also always other kind of levels of government. So part of the story, and it was really interesting to hear Roy explaining that, is about domestic politics. Like, we can't understand the shifting international policies on Syria without also understanding the shifting politics in the US. So, for example, the domestic fallout after Libya influences the Obama administration on Syria. Then, of course, the rise of Trump changes things again, but also other countries too. So in particular, I would say Turkey and Russia are two countries where you can't fully understand what they're doing in and around Syria without also understanding what's happening inside Turkish politics and Russian politics. Which gets me to the next, which is geopolitics and how geopolitics matters. And one of the struggles I had with this book was trying to limit the number of words. And in fact, the final version was about a third shorter than the first draft I sent to the unhappy publisher, who was like, no, you're going to have to cut words. But that's because to explain how things were developing in Syria was necessary also to look at what's happening in the wider world. So I mentioned Russia earlier, but we can't understand the Russian intervention in 2015 without understanding what had happened with Crimea, what had happened with Putin's more robust turn to a kind of authoritarian nationalism, and the rest of it. And again, this seems to me, in one sense, obvious, but of course, whenever you're talking about major international crises, geopolitics is going to matter. But at the same time, it's still something that we often miss in our niche discussions around atrocity prevention. Geopolitics is something that hangs around in the background, but we still don't have a good handle on how it impacts atrocity prevention or what we can do about it, how actors who are engaged in atrocity prevention can better engage with geopolitics in order to get better outcomes and results, particularly once multilateral channels are blocked off or limited. And I think another part of the story, and this becomes apparent towards the end of so I cover only up to 2020. So when I said the end of the series story, I mean the end of my series story, which is only part of the overall story, is that other actors are much better at playing this game than the West are. So there's a really interesting psychodrama, I think, and they're still playing out, which is the kind of Putin and Erdogan psychodrama over Idlib, where you have actually Erdogan understands Putin and Assad's logic much better than Western leaders ever did. He understands that they understand that diplomacy is wrapped up with force and power, and that you can play an incremental game, but you need to be involved in using force and prepared to use force in order to be in the game. And there's a really interesting couple of years where Putin and Erdogan are forever signaling to each other and using back channels to communicate to each other to try and basically work out who is more committed here? Who's prepared to go the furthest in order to achieve their ambitions, where those ambitions collide in northern Syria? The sixth point is a difficult one for people like me who have been studying the United Nations and are very much into international peace and security, which is that sometimes, despite the fact that we say over and over again there are no military solutions, sometimes there are only military solutions. And ultimately, when you step back and look at the whole kind of dispute over who should govern Syria, it is very clear in hindsight that there was only ever going to be a military solution. And when you actually make that realization and you go and look at what the different actors were saying all the way through, that's what they were saying all the way through. Assad was always saying that he would not let go 1 inch of Syria. He said it again and again and again and again. And often in the West, we didn't believe it. We thought, oh, well, he can still negotiate a power sharing deal. Some of the opposition said again and again and again that any political arrangement that left Assad in control of the security forces would not be worth the paper it was written on. So you could not have a deal that left Assad in command of the security forces. So when you go back and look at the statements of positions, it becomes really clear that all the way through, the parties are basically saying this is going to need a military resolution. Force of arms will determine who the future government of Syria is going to be. And then at that point, you have a choice. Do you want to back one side? Do you not? I remember Edward Luttwak, the realist strategist, made a point just after the Russian intervention in the West. There was lots of commentary confused as to why Russia was doing what it was doing. And Luttwak commented by saying, this isn't confusing at all. Russia has decided who its friends are and are supporting its friends and attacking their enemies. But the West can't do the same thing. It can't figure out who its friends are and can't decide whether or not it wants to back them. Is the West's problem, and it's the West's confusion, not Russia's. We may disagree with Russia's position, but its logic is very clear and obvious. The seventh point is a UN-specific point and is one of the more depressing points, which is that the UN has still not addressed the problem identified in Bosnia, identified in Rwanda in the 1990s, of humanitarian aid being manipulated for political purposes. It is absolutely clear that the Assad regime manipulated the flow of humanitarian aid to support itself and undercut the legitimacy of the opposition. To put a very complex story very simply, by blocking aid into opposition-held areas whilst allowing aid into government-held areas. And that basically meant that the UN supported the government's efforts to prop up, to support the improvement of life in government areas where conditions of living collapsed in opposition-held areas. And that became a fundamental part of the government's narrative. This is something identified back in the day in Bosnia. It, of course, was critical after Sri Lanka, where the UN did an internal report on the role of humanitarian aid, and Ban Ki-moon came up with the policy of rights up front, that the UN should always be full and frank in pursuit of human rights. But we've seen rights up front slip to the back at the UN, and one of the consequences is what we then saw in Syria. I saw you were already having this really fruitful discussion about the peace process, and I think Roy is absolutely right that by the time Brahimi is stepping down, it's really clear that the peace process isn't going anywhere. And it's basically is a zombie process, where the process itself matters only to the people in the room, but is being used to legitimate other things. And it's being used by the Assad regime in order to legitimate itself, to make international organizations recognize the government as legitimate and as the legitimate negotiating party, and to create a vehicle by which the government could distinguish between opposition figures it would count as legitimate and those that would be illegitimate. It's absolutely clear that those talks were going nowhere. And by sort of 2017, 2018, they were entirely irrelevant to what was going on actually inside Syria. I've made the point about perpetrators learning from each other, so I'll skip that. And I'll end with a home truth, which is that if we're interested in atrocity prevention, we've got to kind of move beyond, the normative. I think we've done very well at the normative. I think largely advocates of R2P have won the normative argument, in that there is no one standing, apart from maybe North Korea, standing up and saying, you know what, we don't think there is a responsibility to protect. We don't think the UN should be involved in this sort of thing. People don't make those sorts of arguments anymore. And that, again, sounds obvious, but 30 or 40 years ago, people did make those arguments in the UN Security Council. They make different sorts of arguments now. Things like, these aren't atrocities. We don't know who the perpetrators are. These solutions and the strategies we need are too complicated. We don't want to use force, but they don't challenge the normative core. So I think what we need to get better at is thinking about how to bring that normative core to really existing crises. We need to get better at thinking strategically about atrocity prevention, and also become more like kind of Lutvakian realists and thinking about how do you get involved in the dirty business of geopolitics, and how do you use geopolitics? How do you think about power? How do you think about combinations of diplomacy, force, sanctions, and other measures in order to create the strategic effects you need to reduce the incidence of atrocities? And I think that's where we're at now, and that if we don't make that jump, we're just going to see these same problems being reproduced again and again and again, and probably in worse form in the years going forward, because as the restraints are relaxed, so more and more actors will think, well, atrocities are a way of getting, an effective way of getting what I want at a reasonable price. Thanks very much.